When my son told the bank clerk, "She doesn't understand numbers," I did not correct him. I let the sentence land in the marble silence. Let the people behind us hear it. Let the girl at the desk lower her eyes the way young employees do when they smell family humiliation and know they are about to be trapped inside it. Then she looked at my screen, stopped breathing for a second, and forgot my son existed. Hello, my dears. Some people think age means confusion, weakness, dependence. I'll tell you this much. When a grown son tries to shrink his own mother in public, he often has a reason. What would you notice first in my place? I was 80 years old, and I had spent the better part of 6 decades sitting across desks from men who mistook stillness for softness. Bankers, suppliers, shippers, insurers, taxmen, union men, brokers in expensive ties with cheap instincts. I had watched them all make the same mistake. They looked at my gloves, my posture, my age, the silver in my hair, and decided the real conversation would happen with someone else. That morning, Oliver had brought me into Halbrecht Private Bank as if he were escorting a confused aunt through customs. One hand floated near my elbow, not touching me, just near enough to suggest supervision. He wore a navy suit so sharp it could have sliced fruit, a pale watch with a face the size of a biscuit, and the expression he reserved for waiters, parking valets, and people whose names he did not intend to remember. My son was 52 and had perfected a tone that sounded courteous until you listened to the structure of it. He did not ask. He arranged. He did not discuss. He positioned. "Mom gets overwhelmed," he had said to the receptionist before I even sat down. "So I'll walk her through the essentials." I had looked at the receptionist and said, "I don't get overwhelmed. I get impatient." She almost smiled. Oliver pretended not to hear me. The young clerk assigned to us introduced herself as Nora Bell. Good posture, clear voice, minimal jewelry, efficient nails. The kind of woman who could still become formidable if no man married her too early and called it protection. She asked for my identification, and Oliver answered before I moved. "She has it," he said, "but I keep copies of all the important things." "I'm sure you do," I said. He gave me the patient smile adult children use when they want witnesses to admire their sacrifice. "Mom, there are many kinds of disrespect. Some are loud enough to slap. The dangerous kind arrives dressed as concern." Nora took my driver's license directly from my hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrow. Not Ms., not Evelyn. Mrs. Harrow." "Correct." I approved of her immediately. We were shown into a glass-fronted office overlooking the main lobby. Halbrecht had recently renovated, and it smelled of stone dust, lilies, and money that wanted to seem tasteful. Soft brass lamps, cream leather chairs, walnut trim polished to a discreet glow. On a low side table sat a crystal dish of wrapped caramels no one in that building actually ate. The sort of place designed to calm clients while quietly measuring them. Oliver sat beside me instead of across from me. Another little tactic. Unity for appearance, control in practice. Nora folded her hands. "I understand there was an incoming transfer you wanted to review today, Mrs. Harrow." Before I could answer, Oliver leaned forward. "Yes. She received some kind of large payment tied to an old transaction. I'm helping her sort it out. She doesn't really understand the numbers." There it was. Clean, public, efficient, cruel in a practiced way. Nora's expression flickered, just once, and then she turned to her monitor. "Of course," she said quietly. "Let me pull up the account." I crossed one leg over the other and adjusted the cuff of my dove-gray jacket. Loro Piana wool, though Oliver had once called it an old lady suit. He had no eye. Real quality never begged to be noticed. I placed my handbag, a black leather frame bag older than his marriage, on my lap and waited. It is a useful discipline, waiting. Weak people cannot bear silence. Dishonest people rush to fill it. Arrogant people think they are controlling it when they speak into it. I have built entire negotiations by saying less than the person across from me could tolerate. Oliver began before the screen had fully loaded. The main thing, Nora, is simplifying. My mother has too many moving pieces. We've been talking about consolidating oversight, maybe putting safeguards in place. Nothing dramatic, just sensible support. I turned my head and looked at his profile. Beautiful profile, unfortunately. He had inherited his father's jaw and none of his father's decency. What safeguards? I asked. He kept his eyes on Nora. Mom, we've discussed this. No, I said. You've spoken. That is not discussion. A pulse moved once in his cheek. Tiny, but there. Nora's gaze lifted to the screen and then stayed there. Her fingers, which had been moving briskly, stopped altogether. She blinked once, then twice. When she looked up, she looked at me differently. Not with pity, not with indulgence, not even with surprise exactly, with recalculation. Mrs. Harrow, she said, and now her voice had an extra degree of care in it. Would you like me to confirm the amount allowed? Oliver gave a little laugh, the kind people use when they think the room still belongs to them. Yes, please. That's exactly what I mean. Better to say it clearly. I looked at her. Go ahead. She swallowed. The incoming transfer posted this morning in the amount of $58,900,000. Nothing moved in the room for one lovely second. Behind the glass, the lobby continued its soft choreography of wealth. Heels on stone, paper folders changing hands, a man in a camel coat signing something with a fountain pen. But inside that office, the air altered. Oliver's smile remained on his face a fraction too long, like a chandelier left burning after the guests had fled. Then it went out. He turned to the screen as if he could intimidate it. There must be some mistake, he said. No, I said. I had known the final figure would be large, though not the precise hour it would land. The sale had taken months to close and years to become inevitable. People imagine money arrives with trumpets. In real life, it arrives by wire confirmation and legal language after decades of tedious competence. Mine had begun 41 years earlier with 3 regional supply contracts, an underpriced warehouse, and a widow everyone assumed would liquidate instead of expand. I had let them assume it. Assumptions are the cheapest currency in the world and the most profitable. Nora looked from Oliver to me. Mrs. Harrow, would you like a printed summary? Yes, I said. And after that, I would like a complete list of every person with any level of access, authority, note privilege, advisory designation, or secondary contact on all of my accounts, entities, and related holdings. Oliver shifted toward me. Mom, let's not make a spectacle. I turned to him fully then. You made the spectacle, Oliver. I'm merely conducting the meeting. His hand flattened on the desk. You don't need to do this in front of whom? I asked. The clerk you just told I don't understand numbers? Nora lowered her eyes to hide it, but not before I saw it. Respect. Oliver dropped his voice. I'm trying to protect you. No, I said. You are trying to stand between me and information. Men usually do that when the information is expensive. His mouth parted, then closed again. Nora rose slightly. Mrs. Harrow, for privacy, I can move this to our senior office suite. No need, I said. This will do. Then I placed both gloves on the desk, one beside the other, as neatly as surgical instruments, and gave Nora the first instruction that truly mattered. Print everything, I told her. And while you're at it, remove my son's assumption that he speaks for me. Oliver did not like losing rooms. You could see it in the way he adjusted his cuffs, the small mechanical smile returning, as if he could stitch authority back into place with posture alone. He had spent most of his adult life believing that tone created reality. If he sounded certain enough, people followed. That trick worked on waiters, junior lawyers, and sometimes even investors who preferred confidence over competence. It did not work on me. Nora's printer began humming softly in the corner of the office, feeding out page after page of documents. The sound was wonderfully ordinary. Paper sliding, ink drying, quiet mechanical certainty. The sort of sound that accompanies facts when they are about to ruin someone's plan. Oliver leaned closer to me, lowering his voice into the register he used when he wanted to perform patience. "Mom," he said, "you're reacting emotionally." "I'm 80, I replied calmly. If I were reacting emotionally, the lobby would know. His jaw tightened. He turned slightly toward Nora. "What exactly are we printing?" Nora glanced at me first before answering him. Good instinct. Mrs. Harrow requested a full access and authorization report for all linked accounts and entities. Oliver let out a breath that tried to sound amused. "That's excessive." "No," I said. "It's overdue." He shifted in his chair again. "You already know I manage the logistics. You asked me to help." "I asked you to assist with scheduling last year," I said. "You interpreted that as jurisdiction." The printer finished its run. Nora gathered the pages carefully, aligning the corners with the kind of precision that belongs to people who know documents matter. She placed the stack in front of me. "Everything currently attached to your profile, Mrs. Harrow." "Thank you." I opened the packet slowly. The first pages were routine. Primary checking, long-term investment accounts, corporate holdings tied to the sale that had finalized overnight. Clean, expected. Then came the secondary access lines. Oliver Harrow, authorized logistical contact. Oliver Harrow, financial coordination liaison. Oliver Harrow, emergency advisory note privilege. Oliver Harrow, pending oversight review. I read each line once, then again, letting the language settle in my mind like sediment in clear water. "Interesting," I murmured. Oliver forced a laugh. "Those are just standard protections." "Protections for whom?" "For you," he said quickly, "in case something happens." "Something like what?" His eyes flickered. "Health complications, confusion, stress." "Ah." I turned the page. There was a notation beneath the advisory section, a small paragraph, almost administrative in tone. "Client occasionally demonstrates difficulty processing complex financial explanations during meetings with family representative." I looked at the line for a long moment. Then I lifted my eyes to my son. "Did you write this?" Oliver's face stayed very still. "No. It's just an internal observation." "Made by whom?" He shrugged lightly. "Probably a relationship manager note. They record impressions." Nora shifted slightly in her chair. "Actually," she said carefully, "notes like that are usually added after conversations with authorized contacts." Silence stretched across the office. Oliver turned toward her, polite irritation sliding into his voice. Which means it's not exactly a diagnosis, correct? No, Nora said, but it becomes part of the client profile. I tapped the page once with my finger. And what happens, I asked, if enough of these observations accumulate? Nora hesitated. Oliver answered before she could. It just means the bank is aware you might need assistance down the road. I folded the corner of the page neatly. Assistance, I repeated. He leaned back slightly, sensing he had regained a little footing. You know I'm on your side here. I closed the folder. Oliver? Yes? When did you start preparing people to believe I was losing my mind? The question landed cleanly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, I saw something honest move across his face. Not guilt exactly, but calculation forced to change direction. You're twisting this, he said finally. Am I? You've always had too much on your plate. I've been trying to reduce pressure. By telling my bank I can't understand numbers. That's not what I said. I turned the first page of the packet toward him and slid it across the desk. It is precisely what you said. Nora kept her eyes on her monitor now, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She understood something important had shifted. The meeting she thought she was facilitating had become an autopsy. Oliver exhaled slowly through his nose. You're making this dramatic. No, I said. You did that when you spoke. He leaned forward again, lowering his voice. Look, the money complicates things. How? Well, he said carefully, it changes the scale of responsibility. I almost smiled. For whom? For the family. There it was. Not for me. Not for the business that had just closed after 41 years of stubborn, unglamorous growth. Not for the employees whose retirement packages had been built into that final sale. For the family. I rested my hands on the stack of papers. Tell me something, Oliver. What? Before this transfer arrived this morning, how many people did you promise it to? His eyes flashed. I didn't promise anything. Investors? No. Vanessa? That's irrelevant. Your real estate partners? His jaw tightened again. Mom. Oliver. We looked at each other across the desk, the way strangers sometimes do, when they suddenly realize they have been negotiating for years without admitting it. Finally, he leaned back and crossed his arms. You're being paranoid. I turned to Nora. Miss Bell? Yes, Mrs. Harrow? I would like 2 things done immediately. Of course. First, remove every authorization tied to my son until I personally review each one. Oliver straightened instantly. You can't just... I lifted one hand, and he stopped talking. Second, I continued calmly, I want a time-stamped record of every note added to my profile during the past 5 years, including who initiated them. Nora nodded slowly. I can request that from compliance. Please do. Oliver's chair scraped slightly against the floor as he shifted forward. This is ridiculous. No, I said quietly. This is bookkeeping. His voice sharpened. You're embarrassing yourself. I met his eyes. My dear boy, I said. You already handled that part when you told the room I don't understand numbers. Behind the glass walls of the office, the bank continued its quiet, expensive rhythm. Inside the room, my son was beginning to realize that the meeting he had orchestrated was no longer his, and we had only just started. When you reach 80, people assume your past is a soft, nostalgic place filled with knitting baskets and fading photographs. They imagine stories about gardens, old recipes, and polite neighbors who brought pies to the door. They do not imagine contracts. They do not imagine freight routes, supplier disputes, warehouse leases negotiated over bitter coffee at 6 in the morning. They certainly do not imagine an 80-year-old woman who spent 40 years quietly building a logistics network while her own family believed she was balancing checkbooks and attending church lunches. Oliver had been 13 when his father died. That was the year everything divided itself into two columns: what people thought I would do and what I actually did. Most widows in our town sold. They liquidated the business, paid off whatever debts remained, and moved into something smaller and quieter. That was the advice I received from nearly every man who visited the house that first winter. Bank officers with folded hands, suppliers who suddenly spoke slowly, as if grief had damaged my arithmetic. Even my brother-in-law, who had never balanced anything more complicated than a bar tab, suggested I avoid unnecessary stress. The company back then was little more than a regional industrial supply broker. We handled fasteners, machine parts, small equipment shipments between factories scattered across 3 states. It was stable, but unimpressive, which meant most people believed it would collapse without a man sitting at the center of it. They were almost correct. The first 6 months were chaos. 2 clients left immediately. 1 supplier refused to sign renewal terms because, as he politely explained over the phone, he preferred more experienced management. The warehouse foreman resigned, convinced the company would be sold by spring. I did not argue with any of them. Instead, I bought a ledger book thick enough to stop a door and began writing everything down. Every contract clause, every delivery delay, every invoice dispute. I discovered something very quickly. Most men running those companies were not particularly organized. They relied on momentum, reputation, and the assumption that no one would examine the numbers too closely. Numbers, however, were something I understood perfectly. Within 2 years, we had expanded into freight coordination. Within 5, we were managing logistics contracts large enough that the same suppliers who once doubted me began arriving with pastries and apologies. They never said the word apology, of course. Men like that rarely did. Instead, they complimented my persistence. Persistence is a polite word for discipline. Oliver grew up inside that world without ever seeing it clearly. To him, the business was something that kept the lights on and occasionally required his mother to leave the house early. By the time he was in college, the company had already expanded beyond what our town understood. Warehouses in 2 states, rail contracts, equipment storage yards that smelled permanently of oil and iron. But Oliver had developed tastes that belonged to shinier industries: finance, real estate, the language of quick multiplication and sleek offices where success looked expensive. When he graduated, he told me he wanted nothing to do with industrial leftovers. I remember the exact afternoon. We were sitting in my office above the first warehouse, the old brick building near the rail line, where trains still rattled the windows twice a day. I had made tea in a small copper kettle I kept on the radiator. Oliver stood near the door, adjusting the cuffs of a new blazer he clearly believed made him look like a man of consequence. "This place is fine for what it is," he said carefully, glancing around at the filing cabinets and freight maps on the walls. "But it's not really scalable." Scalable. I had looked down at the freight schedule in front of me and asked, "Do you know how many shipments moved through this building last month?" He shrugged. "That's not the point." 612, I said. He gave the polite smile he used when humoring old people. "I just mean the future is somewhere else." And he was right, in his way. The future was somewhere else. but I was the one who moved the company there. Over the next 20 years, we expanded into integrated logistics networks, quietly, methodically. I partnered with regional transport companies nobody in Manhattan had ever heard of. I bought undervalued warehouse land near secondary rail hubs. I hired managers who cared more about reliability than presentation. Oliver watched this happen the way someone watches weather. It existed, but it was not his concern. By the time he began appearing at family gatherings in tailored suits, speaking about investment rounds and development opportunities, the company he dismissed had grown into a structure complex enough that buyers occasionally circled it like cautious sharks. The final acquisition offer arrived 2 years ago. I did not tell Oliver immediately. Not because I feared his reaction, but because I wanted to see how long he would continue assuming that my life was small. Now, sitting in the glass office at Halbrecht Private Bank with $58,900,000 newly resting in my account, I realized something else. Oliver had never been curious about the numbers. He had only been waiting for them. Nora returned 10 minutes later with another folder. The hallway outside the office had grown quieter, the late morning rush thinning into the soft, deliberate pace that private banks prefer. People with real money rarely hurry. They arrive with patience, speak quietly, and leave after the paperwork has rearranged the future in their favor. Oliver, however, had not regained his composure. He sat stiffly beside me, one leg bouncing with the controlled irritation of a man who believed the meeting had taken an unexpected but temporary turn. Every few seconds he checked his phone, then locked the screen again, as if the gesture alone could summon back the authority he thought he owned when we entered the building. When Nora placed the second folder on the desk, she did it with both hands. "Compliance records," she said. "Everything attached to your client profile during the last 5 years." "Thank you," I replied. Oliver leaned forward. "That seems unnecessary." I opened the folder without looking at him. Paper has a very particular smell when it comes directly from an office printer. Warm toner, dry fibers, clean edges, the smell of records that haven't yet been handled by lawyers. The first page listed timestamps, dates, internal notes, advisor flags. Most of them were routine administrative remarks, meeting confirmations, documentation updates, routine verification logs. But every few pages another category appeared. Client comprehension note. I read the first one carefully. Client seemed uncertain about multi-entity distribution structure during family meeting. Son assisted with clarification. Date, 14 months ago. I turned the page. Client appeared overwhelmed discussing asset consolidation. Recommended presence of trusted family liaison in future reviews. Date, 11 months ago. Next page. Client hesitant when reviewing risk diversification. Son suggested simplified explanations moving forward. Date, 9 months ago. Oliver cleared his throat beside me. You're taking these out of context. Am I? These notes are harmless. Harmless to whom? To you, he said quickly. They just make sure someone can help if things get confusing. I looked up from the page and studied him for a moment. Oliver had always been handsome in a deliberate way. His hair was still dark, carefully maintained. His tie sat perfectly centered. Even his frustration was controlled, shaped into a professional expression, meant to imply that he was the reasonable person in the room. But something else had crept into his posture now. Unease. I tapped the page again. "Miss Bell," I said. "Yes?" "Mrs. Harrow. In your experience, what happens if enough of these notes accumulate?" Nora hesitated only a second. In some cases, she said carefully, the bank may recommend additional oversight to protect the client. Additional oversight, I repeated. Oliver shifted again. That's a safety measure. And who usually provides that oversight? He didn't answer. Nora did. Typically, a designated family member, financial guardian, or trustee. I closed the folder gently. Oliver? Yes? Were you planning to become my guardian? His reaction came half a second too slowly. Of course not. Interesting. He spread his hands. You're building a conspiracy out of routine procedures. I leaned back in my chair and studied the ceiling for a moment. Halbrecht had chosen recessed lighting that gave every room the warm glow of an expensive hotel lobby. Calm illumination designed to make difficult financial conversations feel civilized. When I lowered my gaze again, I spoke very quietly. You've been preparing this narrative for at least 14 months. Oliver frowned. That's not what this is. You began planting the idea that I struggle with numbers. I never said that. You said it 20 minutes ago. That was different. Yes, I said. It was louder. The silence that followed was heavier now. Nora's fingers rested lightly on her keyboard, waiting. Oliver's voice hardened slightly. Even if those notes exist, they don't change anything. No? No, he said firmly, because ultimately this is about managing complexity. $58.9 million, I said. You mean that complexity? He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned closer. You're 80, Mom. There are sentences that reveal a person more completely than a confession. That was one of them. You've worked hard your entire life, he continued. But at some point it becomes irresponsible to manage something this large alone. Alone, I repeated. Yes. I folded my hands on the desk. You seem very confident that I am alone. Oliver gave a small, controlled smile. Well, you are. For a moment I said nothing. Then I turned back to Nora. Miss Bell, please note something in the record. She straightened slightly. Yes? Effective immediately, revoke every advisory note submitted by any party other than myself or a licensed financial officer who has met me directly. Oliver sat upright. You can't just erase internal records. I'm not erasing them, I said calmly. I'm disputing them. Nora nodded slowly. That can be filed, yes. And after that, I continued, I would like the names of every employee who approved those notes. Oliver's patience cracked. This is ridiculous. No, I said quietly. This is documentation. He stood up abruptly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. You're acting like I've done something wrong. I looked up at him. Have you? For the first time since we walked into the bank, Oliver did not have an immediate answer. And in that small silence, something became very clear to me. My son had not expected resistance. He had expected timing. He believed the money would arrive, the narrative would already exist, and the transition of control would feel natural to everyone involved. What he had not planned for was the possibility that I might examine the paperwork before handing him the keys. I placed my hand on the folder one more time. Miss Bell, I said calmly. Yes, Mrs. Harrow. I believe this meeting is about to become more interesting. Oliver looked down at me sharply. Why? I met his eyes. Because now, I said, we're going to discuss Vanessa. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a story is not when someone shouts, but when you realize the plan may have started long before today. Tell me honestly, would you already trust Oliver at this point? Oliver's reaction to Vanessa's name was immediate. It was not dramatic. My son had far too much self-control for that. But his shoulders stiffened and his eyes shifted away from mine for a fraction of a second before returning with that careful composure he preferred to wear in public. Small movements reveal more than arguments. "I don't see what Vanessa has to do with this," he said. I folded the compliance folder closed and rested my hand on top of it. "That's interesting," I replied calmly, "because she called me this morning." Oliver blinked. "You spoke to her today?" "Yes." "What did she say?" "She wanted to know if there had been some misunderstanding at the bank." His mouth tightened. Behind the desk, Nora pretended to review something on her screen, but I could see the tension in the angle of her shoulders. Anyone sitting in that room could feel the shift in the air now. This was no longer a financial review. This was a family negotiation happening under fluorescent lighting and legal supervision. Oliver exhaled slowly. "She was probably just checking on you." "No," I said quietly. "She was checking on the money." "That's unfair." "Is it?" He ran a hand over his tie, straightening it again. "You know Vanessa worries about you. I know Vanessa worries about assets." He laughed once, short and irritated. "You've never liked her." "That's not true," I said. He looked at me sharply. "I liked her very much when I first met her. Intelligent, observant, socially skilled. She could walk into a room full of investors and learn the hierarchy within 10 minutes. That's called competence." "Yes," I said. "It is." I let the silence sit there for a moment. Competent people also recognize opportunity. Oliver leaned back again. "You're implying something." "I'm observing something." "You're suspicious of everything suddenly." "No," I said. "Only of patterns." He shook his head slightly, the gesture practiced. "Mom, Vanessa has nothing to do with your accounts." "Really?" "Yes." "Then explain the dinner." His expression froze. "What dinner?" "The one 3 months ago," I said calmly. "At that very loud restaurant where the menus looked like antique newspapers and the chef insisted on serving bone marrow with quince paste." Oliver frowned. "I don't remember." "You should," I interrupted. "It was the evening Vanessa asked me a very specific question." His irritation sharpened. "What question?" I looked down at the compliance folder again, then back up. "She asked whether I had considered streamlining my estate structure before things became complicated." Oliver said nothing. "At the time," I continued, "I assumed she was making polite conversation." "You're reading too much into that." "Perhaps." I turned to Nora. "Miss Bell, do you see many situations where family members become very interested in estate structure shortly before a large transfer arrives?" Nora hesitated. Oliver spoke immediately. "You don't have to answer that." Nora glanced between us. "In general terms," she said carefully, "large transfers can sometimes change family dynamics." Oliver leaned forward. "This is getting absurd." I looked at him. "Is it?" "Yes. Vanessa asked a question at dinner. That doesn't mean anything. Except timing." "Timing of what?" "The acquisition closing." His face went still again. "You told her about the sale?" "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." "Interesting." Oliver rubbed his temple. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "That Vanessa knew something was coming." "She didn't." "Then why?" I asked quietly. "Did she ask me whether I had already arranged who would oversee my finances if I ever felt overwhelmed?" Oliver's patience snapped. "You're 80, Mom!" The words rang louder than he intended. Even the faint activity in the lobby beyond the glass seemed to pause. I tilted my head slightly. Yes, I said. And people at 80 sometimes need help. Help, I repeated again. Yes. With what? With decisions like this. This, I said, tapping the folder lightly, is a bank meeting. It's $58 million. There it was. Not concern, not family. The number. I studied him quietly. Oliver. What? When Vanessa called this morning, do you know what the first thing she asked me was? He didn't answer. She didn't ask how I felt, I continued. She didn't ask if the transfer had surprised me. I leaned forward slightly. She asked whether the funds had already cleared. For the first time since we entered the bank, Oliver truly looked uneasy. Maybe she was just curious. About my liquidity? About stability. Your stability, I said. He stared at me. What does that mean? It means, I replied calmly, that your wife sounded like someone waiting for confirmation. Confirmation of what? That the plan could begin. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the soft hum of the bank's ventilation system to become audible. Oliver finally shook his head. You're imagining things. Am I? Yes. Then answer one simple question. He folded his arms. What? I met his eyes. Why did Vanessa ask me if I had already chosen who would manage my money after I stopped managing it myself? Oliver did not respond. Not immediately. And in that small pause, I saw something important pass across his face. Not anger. Not even fear. Recognition. Which meant I had just stepped on a piece of the truth he thought was still hidden. Oliver recovered faster than most people would have. That was one of the reasons he had been successful in business. When a conversation moved too close to something uncomfortable, he did not panic. He reorganized his tone, rearranged the narrative, and tried to move the discussion onto safer ground. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. You're building a story out of coincidence, he said. Am I? Yes. Vanessa asked a question at dinner. That's normal. About estate control. That's a responsible topic. For whom? For anyone with a family. I watched him for a moment. Oliver had always preferred arguments that sounded reasonable to outsiders. The trick worked beautifully in boardrooms. If you framed something as prudence instead of ambition, most people stopped questioning it. But there is a difference between prudence and preparation. And my son had been preparing. I tapped the compliance folder lightly. 14 months, I said. What? That's how long these notes about my supposed confusion have been appearing. Oliver shrugged. You meet with advisors all the time. People make observations. Observations encouraged by whom? He didn't answer. Behind the desk, Nora shifted slightly, her attention clearly divided between the computer screen and the conversation unfolding in front of her. I turned another page in the folder. More timestamps. More notes. Client appears uncertain about asset distribution. Client requested simplified explanations during meeting. Family liaison recommended for complex reviews. Each sentence was polite, professional, mild, but taken together, they formed something very different. A pattern. I closed the folder again. Oliver. Yes? Tell me something honestly. He smiled faintly. I always do. When did you begin expecting this money? The smile faded. I didn't expect anything. That's not what I asked. He crossed his arms. You're implying I knew about the sale. Did you? No. You're sure? Yes. I tilted my head slightly. That's curious. Why? Because someone clearly believed the timing was close. Oliver's expression hardened. What does that mean? It means Vanessa called me at 9 this morning. So? The transfer posted at 8:42. For the first time since we entered the bank, Oliver hesitated, only for a second. But I noticed. You're reading too much into that, he said finally. Perhaps. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. But you see, Oliver, curiosity works both directions. What are you talking about? When someone begins preparing a narrative about cognitive decline, I become curious about what else they might be preparing. His voice sharpened. You think I'm plotting something? I think, I said calmly, that you have been laying groundwork. For what? That is what we are about to discover. Oliver gave a short, frustrated laugh. You're acting like this is some kind of conspiracy. No. Then what is it? Strategy. His eyes narrowed slightly. You always did like that word. Yes, I said. Because strategy is what people use when they want something before it officially belongs to them. The silence in the office thickened again. Outside the glass wall, a banker in a charcoal suit walked past carrying a leather folder. Somewhere down the hallway, a printer clicked and whirred. Ordinary sounds continued, completely unaware that a family had begun dismantling itself inside a quiet office. Oliver leaned forward again. You're wrong about Vanessa. Am I? Yes. She didn't sound surprised this morning. Maybe she wasn't. Why wouldn't she be? Because people talk. Who talked? He opened his mouth, then stopped. That pause told me more than the answer would have. I watched him carefully. Oliver, I said softly. How many people are waiting for that money? His jaw tightened. No one is waiting for anything. That's interesting. Why? Because most people who promise money they don't have, yet tend to get nervous when the transfer finally arrives. I didn't promise anything. Investors? No. Partners? No. Your development project? His eyes flashed. That has nothing to do with you. Doesn't it? No. I nodded slowly. Then I turned toward Nora again. Miss Bell? Yes, Mrs. Harrow. Earlier you mentioned compliance could provide a list of who submitted these profile notes. That's correct. Good. Oliver's voice cut in sharply. What difference does that make? I met his gaze. Because, I said calmly, if someone has been preparing my bank to believe I'm incapable of managing money. I rested my hand lightly on the folder. Then I intend to find out whether they were also preparing someone else to manage it instead. When you reach 80, patience becomes less of a virtue and more of a tool. I had learned that decades earlier in freight negotiations. If you let the other person speak long enough, they would eventually reveal what they actually feared losing. Not what they said they feared, what they truly feared. Oliver was afraid of time, not time in the philosophical sense. He was afraid of deadlines, financial ones, the sort that begin quietly and then arrive all at once with signatures and consequences attached. He leaned back again, crossing his arms in that familiar posture of controlled dismissal. You're interrogating me over nothing, he said. I'm asking questions and assuming answers. Only where patterns exist. Oliver shook his head slightly, as if explaining something obvious to a stubborn student. You've spent too long around contracts, Mom. Not everything is a scheme. That's true. Exactly. Some things, I continued calmly, are simply preparations. His eyes narrowed. For what? For money that hasn't arrived yet. That's ridiculous. Is it? He leaned forward again. Yes, because I didn't know the sale was closing today. I believe that. He blinked once. You do? Yes. Oliver looked genuinely surprised. Then what exactly are you accusing me of? Not accusing, I said. Observing. Observing what? That you were preparing for something. He let out a short breath. Preparing for what? I studied his face carefully before answering. Liquidity. The word landed harder than anything I had said so far. Oliver's reaction was small, but unmistakable. His jaw shifted slightly, and his eyes flicked toward the folder on the desk before returning to mine. You're imagining things again. Am I? Yes. I rested my hands calmly on the desk. You see, Oliver, there are only a few reasons someone spends more than a year establishing a narrative that their mother might soon struggle with financial decisions. His voice tightened. You're twisting normal family conversations into something ugly. No. Then what are you doing? I'm calculating. He frowned. Calculating what? How urgently someone might need access to $58.9 million. Oliver stood up again, this time more abruptly. This is insane. No, I said quietly. You're accusing your own son of planning to steal from you. I haven't used that word. You're implying it. I'm examining timing. Oliver turned toward the glass wall of the office, looking out into the lobby as if searching for patience among the quiet movement of bankers and clients beyond it. When he turned back, his voice was colder. You've always assumed the worst about my work. That's not true. You never respected what I built. I respected the parts that existed. His eyes flashed. My projects exist. Some of them do. That's insulting. Reality often is. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Oliver said something that interested me far more than anything before it. You don't understand the pressure. What pressure? The kind that comes with scale. Scale of what? Investments. I tilted my head slightly. What kind of investments require this much tension the morning a transfer arrives? Oliver immediately realized he had said too much. Nothing, he said quickly. I was speaking generally. Of course. The silence stretched again. Finally, I picked up the compliance folder and closed it fully. Miss Bell. Yes, Mrs. Harrow. Has compliance responded yet? She checked her screen. They're compiling the submission records now. Excellent. Oliver looked at me sharply. You're really doing this? Yes. You're turning a simple meeting into an investigation. I met his eyes. Oliver. What? If someone has been quietly preparing the ground to control my finances, I paused. Then the least I can do is discover whether they were also preparing someone else to spend them. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely begins with hostility. It begins with adjustments, small ones. A suggestion here, a comment there, a moment when someone answers a question that was not directed at them, and everyone allows it because it seems harmless. Oliver had been adjusting the edges of my life for more than a year. I simply had not bothered to measure the changes until today. Nora's keyboard clicked softly as she checked the compliance system again. The quiet mechanical rhythm filled the room while Oliver stood beside the chair he had just pushed back, his arms folded tightly across his chest. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. Perhaps. It's a bank meeting, Mom, not a courtroom. Every bank meeting is a courtroom, I replied. The verdict just arrives in numbers instead of words. He exhaled sharply and sat down again, this time leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Listen, he said, lowering his voice. Even if you don't trust me right now, you have to admit something. What is that? This amount of money changes things. Yes. You can't just manage it the way you manage the business. Why not? Because this is different. How? It's liquid. I nodded slowly. And liquidity makes people nervous. It creates responsibility, he corrected. For whom? For everyone involved. I studied him for a moment. You keep saying everyone. Well, yes. Name them. Oliver hesitated. Family. Anyone else? No. You're sure? Yes. The lie was not particularly elegant, but lies rarely are when someone is tired. Outside the office, two bankers passed by speaking quietly about a portfolio review. Somewhere farther down the hallway, a phone rang once and then stopped. The bank continued its calm, insulated routine while my son and I sat across from each other, dismantling the illusion of trust we had apparently been maintaining for years. Nora cleared her throat gently. Mrs. Harrow? Yes? Compliance has located the submission records. Oliver's head turned immediately. What records? The internal notes regarding client comprehension, Nora said carefully. I nodded. Who submitted them? She scanned the screen. There are several entries from standard advisory staff. And one from a former relationship manager. That seems normal. And two, she continued slowly, submitted through authorized client liaison communication. Oliver spoke quickly. That just means I relayed information during meetings. Perhaps, I said. Nora looked up from the screen. The liaison listed on those entries is Oliver Harrow. The room became very quiet. Oliver did not look surprised, but he did look annoyed. That doesn't mean anything, he said immediately. They ask questions during reviews and I answer them. That's normal. Questions like whether I understand numbers? That's not what I said. It's what was recorded. He leaned back again. You're twisting routine compliance language into something dramatic. Possibly. Nora hesitated, then added softly. There is also one additional note attached to the liaison entries. Oliver's eyes flicked toward her. What note? She read from the screen. Family representative expressed concern that client may become overwhelmed managing large-scale financial decisions in the near future. Oliver spoke immediately. That was taken out of context. I tilted my head slightly. Near future. Yes. That's an interesting phrase. It was a general concern. General about what? About aging. And money. No. Then why mention financial decisions? Oliver's voice sharpened. Because that's what we were discussing. I folded my hands on the desk again. You were preparing them? For what? For the moment when someone might suggest I should no longer manage my own accounts. That's not what I meant. But it is what you created. He opened his mouth to argue again, then stopped. The argument had already reached the point where repetition replaced explanation. And repetition is where truth usually hides. I looked at him calmly. You expected this transfer? No. You prepared the bank to doubt my judgment before it arrived. That's not fair. Fairness isn't the subject? Then what is? Timing. Oliver rubbed his temple again. You're making a problem out of nothing. Am I? Yes. I considered him quietly. Then I asked the question that had been waiting since the beginning of the meeting. Oliver? I said softly. What? If you didn't know the money was coming. I leaned forward slightly. Why did you spend 14 months preparing the bank to believe I shouldn't control it when it did? My dear friends, let's pause for a moment. Imagine sitting in that quiet bank office, realizing the person across from you may have been preparing to take control of your life for more than a year. The question is simple. What would you do in Evelyn's place right now? Write it in the comments. Oliver did not answer my question. That by itself was already an answer. When someone is innocent, they usually argue immediately. They defend themselves with noise. Explanations spill out of them because silence feels dangerous. Oliver chose silence. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the desk as if the grain of the walnut wood might provide a safer conversation. Finally, he said, very carefully, "You're misunderstanding the purpose of those notes." "Explain it to me," I said. "They were precautionary." "Precaution against what?" "Future complications." "What kind of complications?" "With the business sale." That caught my attention. "You said you didn't know about the sale." "I didn't know it was closing today," he corrected quickly. "But you knew it existed." Oliver hesitated. Then he sighed. "Mom, rumors travel." "Rumors?" "Yes." "From where?" "People in your industry talk." "That's true." I studied him for a moment. "And which of those people told you the sale was close enough that you needed to begin preparing the bank to doubt my judgment?" Oliver rubbed his forehead again. "You're twisting everything." "No," I said quietly. "I'm listening carefully." Nora sat very still behind the desk, her eyes fixed on the screen, but her attention clearly in the room. Oliver leaned forward again. "You're acting like I planned something sinister." "Didn't you?" "No." "Then help me understand the logic." "There is no logic," he said impatiently. "It's just family support. Support that happens to appear in compliance records. That's how banks work. And support that begins 14 months before a transfer. That's coincidence." I folded my hands again. "Oliver." "What?" "You've always disliked coincidence." He looked up at me sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means you're a planner." "That's called being responsible." "Yes," I said. "It is." The silence returned. Then Nora cleared her throat again. "Mrs. Harrow, there is something else attached to the compliance records." Oliver's head turned instantly. "What now?" She looked uncertain for a moment, then read from the screen. "There is an internal advisory flag created 3 months ago." "By whom?" I asked. "By the previous relationship manager assigned to your account." "What does it say?" Nora hesitated, then continued. "Recommended review of potential future financial guardianship structure due to family concerns about client cognitive strain." Oliver spoke immediately. "That's standard language." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "Yes." "For whom?" "For any client your age managing assets of this size." I nodded slowly. "That's interesting." "Why?" "Because 3 months ago the sale hadn't even been announced yet." Oliver said nothing. I leaned forward slightly. "Which means someone convinced the bank to begin discussing guardianship before the money even existed in my account." He opened his mouth, closed it again, closed it. That was the moment everything shifted. Up until now, Oliver had been arguing about interpretations, tone, context, intent. But guardianship is not a casual word. Guardianship means legal authority, control, access, decision-making power. And once that idea appears in a financial institution's records, it becomes very difficult to remove. I watched my son carefully. "Oliver," I said softly. "What?" "If the bank had decided I was no longer capable of managing my finances." His eyes flicked toward the folder again. "Who exactly was supposed to take over?" Oliver did not answer immediately. That alone told me enough. When people have rehearsed something for months, their response usually arrives quickly, smooth as a polished table. But Oliver was not answering a rehearsed question anymore. He was answering the one thing he had hoped would never be asked directly. Guardianship discussions don't mean anything by themselves, he said carefully. That wasn't my question. You're jumping ahead. No, I said calmly. I'm arriving exactly where the paperwork leads. Nora sat very still behind her desk, her hands resting lightly on the keyboard, as if she had suddenly become aware that every word spoken in that room could eventually matter to lawyers. Oliver leaned forward again. Even if the bank had recommended additional oversight, he said, that doesn't mean control would automatically transfer to anyone. Someone would have to accept the responsibility. That's hypothetical. So is your innocence, I replied quietly. His jaw tightened. You're being insulting. I'm being precise. The folder remained open between us like a ledger of intentions. 3 months ago, I continued, someone introduced the concept of guardianship into my financial record. That was the relationship manager. At the suggestion of whom? Oliver rubbed his temple again, clearly wishing the conversation had never left the simple narrative he had prepared for the morning. You know how these institutions work, he said. They look ahead. Yes. They evaluate risk. Yes. And they listen to family concerns. Exactly. The words settled between us like a small stone dropped into still water. Oliver realized too late what he had just admitted. You're twisting my words again. No, I said softly. You just finished the sentence. He leaned back sharply in the chair. You're making it sound like I tried to take over your life. Didn't you? Of course not. Then why prepare the bank to believe I couldn't manage it? Because you're 80. His voice rose again before he caught himself. Nora glanced briefly toward the glass wall of the office, probably aware that raised voices carried farther in quiet buildings like this one. Oliver lowered his voice again. Age matters in financial planning. It does. And large sums require structure. They do. So why are you acting like that's some kind of crime? I studied him quietly. Because the truth had already begun assembling itself in my mind. Not perfectly, not completely. But the outline was there. Oliver, I said calmly. What now? When someone begins preparing legal guardianship structures, it's usually because they expect to need them soon. That's speculation. Is it? Yes. I nodded once. Then let's discuss something simpler. What? Your development project. His expression hardened immediately. That has nothing to do with this. Doesn't it? No. You mentioned investors earlier. That was a general comment. You also mentioned pressure. Everyone has pressure. Yes, I said. But not everyone begins preparing financial guardianship paperwork for their mother at the same time. Oliver stood again. You're unbelievable. Perhaps. You're accusing me of planning to steal $58 million. I haven't accused you of stealing anything. Then what exactly are you accusing me of? I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands. Planning. He stared at me. What does that mean? It means, I said calmly, that someone in this situation believed the money would eventually become accessible. That's absurd. Is it? Yes. Then answer one simple question. Oliver's patience was almost gone now. What? If the bank had decided I needed a guardian, I looked directly into his eyes. Whose name would have appeared on the paperwork? Oliver did not sit down again. He remained standing beside the chair, looking at me as if the room had suddenly become too small for both of us. "You're being paranoid," he said. "Possibly. There was never any guardianship plan. Then the bank's record is simply a creative exercise. You know that's not what I meant. Explain what you meant." Oliver paced 2 steps toward the glass wall of the office, then stopped. Outside, a man in a charcoal suit walked past, speaking quietly into his phone, completely unaware that the calm little room beside him had turned into something closer to a battlefield. When Oliver turned back, his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. "You're 80 years old," he said. "Yes. And this amount of money? 58.9 million. "Yes," he snapped. "That amount requires structure." "I agree. So someone has to think ahead." "I also agree." He blinked. For a moment he seemed unsure where the argument had gone. "Then why are you acting like I've done something wrong?" "Because of the order in which you thought ahead." Oliver frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "you began preparing the bank before the money arrived." "That's responsible planning." "No," I said. "Responsible planning would have involved speaking to me." "You would have refused." "You didn't ask." Oliver ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had not seen from him since he was a teenager, trying to solve algebra homework he did not actually care about. "You're twisting everything I say." "No." "Yes." "No," I repeated quietly. "I'm removing the decorations." The silence stretched again. Finally, he said something different. "You've always underestimated how complicated my work is." "Tell me about it." He looked surprised. "What?" "Your work," I said. "Explain the complications." Oliver hesitated. "You wouldn't understand the structure." "Try me." He stared at the desk for a moment, then spoke carefully. "There are development projects." "Yes, large ones." "I assume so. They require capital commitments." "Of course. And investors expect those commitments to be honored." "That seems reasonable." Oliver exhaled slowly. "So yes," he said, "there's pressure sometimes." I nodded. "How much?" "What?" "How much pressure?" "That's none of your business." "Your finances become my business the moment you begin preparing legal guardianship paperwork around my assets." His jaw tightened again. "You keep repeating that word." "Because it appeared in my bank records." "It was just a discussion." 3 months ago." "Yes. Right when your development project started expanding." Oliver froze, just for a moment. But that moment was enough. "You've been looking into my work now?" he said sharply. "No," I replied. "I've been listening." "To what?" "To you." He stared at me. I leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned investors." "So?" "You mentioned pressure." "That doesn't mean—" "And you mentioned scale." Oliver said nothing. The pieces were sliding into place now. Not perfectly yet, but close. "Oliver," I said quietly. "What?" "How much money did you promise them?" His eyes flashed with anger. "I didn't promise anyone anything." "That's not what I asked." He pointed at the desk. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You jump to conclusions." "I asked a question. A ridiculous one." "Then answer it." Oliver's voice rose again before he forced it back down. "My business has nothing to do with your accounts. It has everything to do with them if you expected access." "I never expected access." "Then why?" I asked calmly. "Did you spend 14 months preparing a financial institution to believe I shouldn't control my own money?" Oliver stared at me. For the first time since the meeting began, the confidence was gone from his face. not replaced by guilt, replaced by calculation. Which meant something else had just become clear to me. My son had not simply been planning to control my money. He had been counting on it. Oliver's silence stretched long enough that even the quiet hum of the bank's air system seemed louder. That was when I understood something important. He was not deciding whether to tell the truth. He was deciding how much of it I already knew. "You're making assumptions again," he said finally. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm noticing arithmetic." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means that pressure rarely appears without a number attached to it." Oliver sat down again, slower this time. The energy had drained out of the room, replaced by something colder and more cautious. "My projects are financed normally," he said. "Define normally." "Equity commitments, bridge capital, phased investment." "And personal guarantees?" His eyes lifted sharply. "That's standard practice." "Sometimes." He leaned forward again. "You're trying to make this sound like I'm drowning in debt." "I didn't say drowning. You implied it." "I implied urgency." Oliver laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You think I need your money. I think someone around you believes you do. That's insulting." "Is it?" "Yes." I watched him for a moment. Oliver had always disliked conversations where the other person remained calm. Anger he could handle. Emotion he could redirect. But calm questions forced him to reveal more than he intended. He rubbed his forehead again. "You have no idea how development financing works. Explain it to me." "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." Oliver hesitated. Then he spoke. "When you build something large, housing, commercial space, infrastructure, you don't just use one pool of money." "I know." "You secure early capital." "Yes." "Then you leverage that to attract larger investors." "That's basic financing." "Exactly." "And if the early capital disappears?" Oliver stopped. The silence answered for him. "You lose credibility," I said quietly. "That's not what's happening." "Then why mention pressure earlier?" "Because there's always pressure in development." "Yes," I said. "But pressure rarely involves preparing guardianship records for your mother." His voice hardened again. "You keep circling back to that." "Because it's the only part of this story that happened inside my bank." Oliver leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said something very softly. "You've always thought the worst of me." "That's not true." "Yes, it is." "No," I said calmly. "I've always thought you were ambitious." "That's not a crime." "It becomes a problem when ambition requires access to someone else's decisions." Oliver looked at me again. "You really believe I planned all this?" "I believe you expected something." "And what exactly did I expect?" "That eventually someone would convince the bank I shouldn't manage my own finances. And then someone trustworthy would step in." He let out a short breath. "You think that someone was me?" "I think that's the obvious candidate." "You're unbelievable." "Possibly." Oliver shook his head slowly. "You've turned a family conversation into a financial interrogation." "You began the interrogation when you told the bank I don't understand numbers." His mouth tightened again. "That was a figure of speech." "It was a mistake." The room fell quiet again. Nora remained motionless behind the desk, clearly trying to become invisible while still listening to every word. Oliver finally spoke again. "Even if the bank had asked me to help manage things." "Yes?" "That wouldn't mean I controlled the money." "No," I said. "What then?" It would mean you controlled the decisions. Oliver looked at the folder on the desk, then back at me. You really don't trust me. I held his gaze. Oliver, what? If someone promises investors money they don't have yet. He waited. They tend to become very interested in who controls the person who does. Friends. Imagine the tension in that quiet office. A son standing across from his 80-year-old mother, realizing she understands far more than he expected. Now the question becomes sharper. If you discovered someone had been preparing to control your money for months, would you forgive them? Or finish the conversation right there? Tell me what you would do. Oliver stared at me for several seconds after I finished speaking. There was anger in his face now, but something else had joined it. Fear. Not the loud kind. The careful kind that arrives when a person realizes the discussion has reached a place they cannot easily escape. You don't know anything about my investors, he said quietly. I don't need to. Yes, you do. Why? Because you're making assumptions about deals you've never seen. I tilted my head slightly. That's interesting. What is? You just confirmed there are deals. Oliver's lips pressed into a thin line. You're twisting words again. No, I said calmly. You're providing them. He pushed his chair back and stood again, this time pacing once across the small office. The movement was controlled, but restless. Like a man who suddenly understood that the ground beneath his argument had become unstable. You think I'm desperate, he said. I think you're under pressure. That's not the same thing. It often becomes the same thing. He stopped near the glass wall and looked out into the lobby. A young banker escorted a client toward the elevators, both of them speaking quietly, the entire building wrapped in that calm, expensive silence institutions cultivate so carefully. Oliver turned back toward me. You've always believed you were the smartest person in the room. No, I said. Only the most patient. He gave a short laugh. Well, congratulations. You've turned a family conversation into a spectacle. You started the spectacle when you told the clerk I don't understand numbers. That was a joke. It was an attempt. To do what? To establish a narrative. Oliver's expression hardened again. You keep using that word. Because that's what this is. No, he said. This is you humiliating your own son. Humiliation requires an audience. And we have one, he snapped, glancing briefly toward Nora. I followed his gaze. Nora immediately looked down at her keyboard again, clearly wishing she had scheduled her lunch break 20 minutes earlier. I turned back to Oliver. You're mistaken, I said quietly. About what? The audience. He frowned. What does that mean? It means this conversation stopped being private the moment guardianship appeared in my bank record. Oliver's shoulders stiffened. You can't seriously think this goes anywhere beyond this room. I held his gaze. Oh, I think it goes exactly where the paperwork goes. His voice dropped. You wouldn't. Wouldn't what? Escalate this. Why not? Because it would destroy the family. I studied him for a moment. Oliver. What? If the family depends on silence to survive. I paused. Then it isn't much of a family. The words settled between us like a closing door. Oliver looked away again. When he spoke next, his voice was quieter than before. You're overreacting. Perhaps. You don't even know what my situation is. Then enlighten me. He hesitated. For a moment, it almost looked like he might. But then the moment passed. You wouldn't understand, he said. I nodded slowly. That may be true. He looked relieved for a fraction of a second. Then I continued. But I do understand something else. His eyes narrowed. What? I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm and steady. I understand that someone in your position would need access to money very quickly if investors suddenly started asking questions. Oliver went very still, and in that silence, the entire truth finally stepped out from behind the argument. My son had not simply hoped to manage my money. He had already begun spending it in promises. Oliver did not deny it. He didn't confirm it either. But denial requires energy, and I could see the energy draining from him now, replaced by the quiet exhaustion that appears when a plan finally collapses under its own weight. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. I know enough. No, you don't. I leaned back slightly in the chair. Then explain it. There's nothing to explain. Oliver. What? If investors weren't expecting money, you wouldn't be this nervous. He ran a hand across his face slowly. That's not why I'm nervous. Why then? Because you're destroying something that didn't need to be destroyed. What exactly is that? Our trust. I considered the word. Trust requires honesty. I was honest. You told a bank clerk I don't understand numbers. That was a strategy. He looked at me sharply. You really think everything I do is manipulation? No, I said calmly. Only the parts that involve paperwork. The silence stretched again. Finally, Oliver sat down heavily, the chair creaking slightly beneath the sudden shift in weight. You don't understand the situation, he said. Then help me understand. He stared at the desk for several seconds. There are people involved. Investors. Yes. How much? That's not important. It becomes important if you were counting on my money to solve it. I wasn't counting on it. You were preparing for it. That's different. Not to a banker. He exhaled slowly. It's temporary. What is? The pressure. How temporary? A few months. And after those months, the project stabilizes. And the early investors? They get paid. With what? Oliver hesitated. The answer sat in the room before he spoke it. Future liquidity. I nodded slowly. And if that liquidity didn't arrive, it will. That's optimism. It's planning. I studied him quietly. You promised them something. I promised progress. That's not what investors hear. He didn't argue. Outside the office, the bank remained perfectly calm. The quiet machinery of wealth continued operating just as it had before we arrived. But inside that room, the truth had already rearranged everything. Oliver, I said. What? If the bank had decided I needed a guardian, he looked up. You would have had legal authority to manage my finances. That doesn't mean I would have taken your money. No, I said. It just means you would have had access. That's not the same thing. It becomes the same thing when investors are waiting. Oliver looked away again. For the first time all morning, he seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, strategically. You think the worst of me, he said quietly. No, I replied. What then? I think you convinced yourself that borrowing from my future was temporary. He didn't answer, which meant I had guessed correctly. I closed the folder slowly and rested both hands on the desk. Oliver. What? You built a financial plan around money that didn't belong to you yet. His voice was almost a whisper now. It was supposed to work. Plans often are. You don't understand how fast things move once investors are involved. Oh, I said quietly. I understand that part perfectly. He looked at me again. Then what are you going to do? That was the first honest question he had asked all morning. I met his eyes. And for the first time since the meeting began, I allowed a small, deliberate pause before answering. First, I said calmly, I'm going to make sure no one ever mistakes my money for yours again. Oliver kept watching me after I spoke. That was the moment he finally understood the meeting was over, not because the conversation had ended, but because the outcome had already been decided. What does that mean? He asked quietly. It means, I said, that the next decisions will not involve you. His jaw tightened again. You can't just cut me out. I can. I'm your son. Yes. That still means something. It does, I said calmly. It means you had more trust than anyone else. He looked away. And you chose to spend it. Oliver stood up again, but this time there was no performance in the movement, no controlled posture, no careful smile meant to reassure observers, just fatigue. You're going to ruin everything, he said. Your project? Our family. I considered that for a moment. Our family, I repeated. Yes. You began preparing legal control over my finances without telling me. That's not what You told a bank employee I don't understand numbers. That was a mistake. You planted 14 months of compliance notes suggesting cognitive decline. I was trying to protect you. You introduced guardianship discussions before the money even arrived. Oliver stopped speaking. The quiet in the office felt heavier now. Finally, he said, What happens next? I turned to Nora. Miss Bell. Yes, Mrs. Harrow. I would like 3 things arranged today. She nodded immediately. Of course. First, remove every advisory and liaison authorization associated with my son permanently. Nora began typing. Second, transfer oversight of all portfolio management to an independent fiduciary firm. No family involvement. Understood. And third, I said calmly, prepare documentation establishing a trust structure that places the majority of these funds beyond personal access, including mine. Oliver looked up sharply. What? I met his eyes. Money causes confusion in families. You're punishing me. No, I said. I'm removing temptation. That's insane. It's discipline. You're locking away $58 million just to prove a point. No. Then why? Because I spent 40 years building something carefully. Oliver shook his head. You're throwing it away. No, I said quietly. I'm protecting it. He stared at the desk again. And what happens to me? That depends on you. How? If you rebuild your projects honestly, you'll succeed or fail on their own merits. And if I don't, then my money was never going to save them anyway. Oliver stood there for several seconds. Then he asked the question he should have asked at the beginning of the meeting. Why didn't you just help me? I looked at him calmly. Because you didn't ask. And that's how Evelyn's story ends. Some of you may think she did the right thing protecting what she built. Others may feel a mother should forgive more. Tell me honestly, what would you have done in her place? Write it in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.